Hey guys, today Big Daddy and I are going to show you a little bit about Mississippian William Faulkner. Right now we're in New Albany and we're going to explore his birthplace. Then we'll make our way to Oxford and show you William Faulkner in Oxford. Come along with us. Let's go explore. This is the Union County Historical Society and Heritage Museum. This happens to be Memorial Day when I'm making this video, so the museum is not open, but it seems to have lots of neat exhibits. It's got art and indoor and outdoor exhibits. It has a portrait of William Faulkner along with some first edition Faulkner books and also a Faulkner literary garden. William Faulkner was born in New Albany on September the 25th, 1897. Actually, the Faulkner's house is, of course, no longer here. It was kind of a white wood frame house that sat in this general area. The Faulkners were a railroad family, and a few years after baby William and his brothers were born, the family moved to Oxford. One more thing before we leave William Faulkner's birthplace site. There's a Mosley and Johnson, Mississippi Blues Trail marker just down the street past the museum there. You should check it out when you visit the museum. If you make your way behind the Faulkner birthplace and back toward the museum, behind it, of course, you can see these old farm implements like the hay rake and the plows. They're kind of neat to see how things were done in times past. Now let's make our way to Oxford and visit Faulkner's Rowan Oak. As you pull up to Rowan Oak, you see this Mississippi Writers Trail marker, of course, telling you all about William Faulkner. I'd like to mention that his first book, The Marble Fawn, published in 1924, was paid for by a friend of Mr. Faulkner's, and well, it's a collection of what's considered to be juvenile poems. If you can find a copy of The Marble Fawn, keep it. Now we're starting up the driveway to Faulkner's Rowan Oak, and you'll notice a little stand here that is normally filled with brochures and maps of the grounds. Today, of course, there are none. Faulkner's first novel was called Soldier's Pay. Well, it was his first novel that he published. Not real sure if it was the first novel he had ever written. Notice the very large eastern red cedar trees. They were planted sometime after a yellow fever epidemic swept the South. It was believed in those days that cedars cleansed the air. Of course, the red cedar is not native to Mississippi, but it obviously thrives here. Faulkner's next novel was called Mosquitoes. It was satire. In 1929, Mr. Faulkner published Satirus. It was a novel about social upheaval and after the Civil War and the general deterioration of the Mississippi aristocracy. Also in 1929, he published The Sound and the Fury. It was set in Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha County. We're at William Faulkner's Rowan Oak. I'm going to take a minute to look around the yard. In 1930, Mr. Faulkner bought what was then called the Bailey Place. It's a primitive Greek revival house built by a guy named Colonel Robert Shegog. He was an Irish immigrant planter from Tennessee. Mr. Faulkner renamed the home after the rowan tree, which is a symbol of security and peace. He called the home Rowan Oak. In a short time, he moved in his wife Estelle and her two children from a previous marriage, and then a couple years later, their own daughter Jill was born. Rowan Oak was the family home of the Faulkners until his death. I like to imagine as I'm walking around that around the corner and step up on the porch of the house and bump into the great man, as perhaps he's creating another fine work of literature. It's been told that Mr. Faulkner would come outside with his typewriter from time to time and sit under one of the couple of covered patios that you've seen and, well, of course, write his novels. In 1930, he published As I Lay Dying. In 1931, Sanctuary and These 13. Let's take a look at the sunken patio. Before 1930, the spring house was located on this spot. The sunken patio was built for Jill's wedding reception. As we make our way down to the sunken patio, let's talk a little bit more about Mr. Faulkner's novels. He published Light in August in 1932, Dr. Martino and Other Stories in 1934, Pylon in 1935, and Absalom in 1936. This is the sunken patio constructed for Jill's wedding reception. We're going to make our way toward the smokehouse, but let's talk a little bit more about his novels. He published The Unvanquished in 1938, The Wild Palms in 1939, The Hamlet in 1940, and one of my favorites, Go Down Moses in 1942, The Intruder in the Dust in 1948. Okay, now you're beginning to see the kitchen or smokehouse through the trees. The kitchen is original 1840s construction. Its bricks were made on the property. In the 30s, Mr. Faulkner converted the kitchen to a smokehouse, and this is where he smoked and stored his hams. An indoor kitchen was added to the house in the early 1900s. It's not too hard for me to imagine him sitting in one of these Adirondack chairs working on some novel or another. We're making our way back toward the servants' quarters. They were built by Faulkner on a foundation from some 1840s structures. This was the first home of the beloved Faulkner family caretakers. Originally, this was the home of Caroline Barr. She lived in the house from 1930 to 1940 when she died at the age of 100. Then this became the home of Andrew and Chrissy Price. Andrew was Mr. Faulkner's groom, and Chrissy was Estelle's housekeeper. The Price's son John lived here until the mid-80s. Perhaps as we look at this lovely tree, it would be a great time to tell you that in 1949, Mr. Faulkner published Knight's Gambit, and he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's Mississippi's only native-born Nobel laureate. As we finish looking around the yard, I need to mention that in 1950, he published some collected short stories and won the National Book Award. In 1951, he published Requiem for a Nun. In 1954, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award for A Fable. This is Mr. Faulkner's barn. It was built in the 1840s and served as a log cabin for the family to live in while the main house was being built. Mr. Faulkner used the barn to keep his milk cow safe and to house his yard tools. It's easy to see as we look around here how William Faulkner truly had everything he needed here at Rowan Oak. In 1957, Mr. Faulkner published The Town. The Mansion was published in 1959. In 1962, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for The Reivers. and his last novel in 1973, 11 years after his death, Flags in the Dust. Flags in the Dust was published in 1929 as Sartoris. Of course, the original manuscript was heavily edited by Mr. Faulkner's publisher. So let's take a look at William Faulkner's stables. This was the home of Mr. Faulkner's favorite horse, Tempe, and of course his other horses as well. This would have been the place where Mr. Faulkner kept his feed and his tack, and well, probably even a horse trailer. I can just imagine walking through here and seeing the great Arthur leaned up to the door talking to his favorite horse. We're about to leave and make our way to the cemetery, but first we want to go toward what's left of the concentric circle garden. This garden is in the center of the circle of cedars, and it was originally a maize garden. It has raised brick beds, and they probably contain sweet shrub and privet hedges. During Reconstruction, several volunteer trees sprang up in the garden, but Mr. Faulkner seemed to have liked the Gothic nature of the garden, if you will, and he left it like that. He joked that Judith Chigog's ghost threatened to haunt him if he messed with her garden. Okay guys, as we leave Mr. Faulkner's gardens, let's go to the cemetery and visit with him at his final resting place. I want to take just a few seconds to show you a little section of the Bailey Woods Trail. This will take you ultimately to the University of Mississippi Museum. On the way to the cemetery, I decided to stop and show you a few other sites connected to Mr. Faulkner. This, of course, is St. Peter's Episcopal Church. It's had several distinguished parishioners over the years, but I just think it's beautiful architecture, and it's a real neat place and close to downtown Oxford. Well, it is downtown, but it's also very close to one of my favorite William Faulkner sites in Oxford. Let's go next door to the courthouse. I can imagine Mr. Faulkner sitting on the benches here and watching the comings and the goings, and perhaps even getting inspiration for his characters of his fictional Yoknapatawpha County. I did much better that time. That pronunciation's always given me trouble. Don't know if you can read it or not, but the little brass plate says, "The citizens of Yoknapatawpha County acknowledge our debt to his genius and dedicate this statue in honor of his memory." As hokey as this is, I just couldn't help myself. I always have to sit down and have a conversation with the great one. Mr. Faulkner, seated on the park bench, is located just under the window on the right side of the building you see before you. Of course, in the middle of the square is the Lafayette County Courthouse. We've made our way to Oxford Memorial Cemetery, and as you can see, we found the sign that lets you know you're close to the location of his grave. It's kind of on the side of the cemetery, not in what I call the main entrance, but come around to the side. And as you can see here in just a second, right down here to the left is St. Andrew's United Methodist Church. So if you can't figure it out, then find the church that's up on the top of that hill on the left and come down until you see this sign. And just like the sign says, Mr. Faulkner's grave is located just 20 steps or so from the edge of the cemetery. You'll notice when we get up here that people leave him bottles of bourbon and other things to enjoy. Mr. Faulkner was a bourbon connoisseur and apparently enjoyed to sit under the trees of Rowan Oak and sip his beverage. You can make your way around, but I would suggest maybe that you be careful because this is located basically on a hillside and there's not much room to walk. But just like Rowan Oak, it's a calming and serene sort of location. Mr. Faulkner is there on the left, and his wife, Estelle, is on the right, and one of her children from a previous marriage is behind them there. In this shot, you can see a little bit better the coins that people have left on their monument to, of course, signify that they visited, and some of the liquor bottles sitting around. There's a half pint of Jack Daniels sitting right above Estelle's grave. Here's a little bit better view of Malcolm's grave. Now you can see St. Andrew's United Methodist Church in the background a little better, so you can get the location of the Faulkner's graves. I think Mr. Faulkner is arguably the best, certainly one of the best American writers ever.
Okay guys, Big Daddy and I hope you've enjoyed your visit with William Faulkner today. And we encourage you to do some research and learn a little bit about he and his life, and especially read some of his books. Thank you.